Okay, great. We will begin. I think people are going to probably continue to filter in, but welcome. This is Page Views Live, which I realized is celebrating its third anniversary this season. We began doing these webinars during the dark days of the pandemic as a way to extend the reach of our page views feature, which was developed to spotlight exciting new publications in film and media studies. And I think our hope was that it would turn into sort of the film quarterly book club and a place where we can have these conversations about exciting new books like D. Andy Rice's Political Camerawork that we'll be speaking about today. I'm Rebecca Prime, and I've been at the Journal for about 5 years now, but have only stepped into the role of editor this past July when Ruby Rich retired. And so I'm very happy to be continuing this great tradition and to be moderating these conversations. So today I would like to welcome, first we have Bruno Guaraná, who is our Page Views editor and sort of curator. He selects the books and is just the most amazing generalist, because he's always able to do these marvelous close readings and conversations with the authors. So great to have you here, Bruno. Bruno has the wonderful title of Master Lecturer in Film and Media Studies at Boston University. So always nice. That's a new hairdo today, although we realized actually the hairdo he had when we began 3 years ago. So full circle.
That's right.
And then joining Bruno in conversation, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to D. Andy Rice, who is joining us from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, which was actually my grandparents' alma mater. So
Oh,
yep.
okay.
My grandmother was like the sweetheart of some sorority or something at Miami University. So it's always been on my radar. But and Andy is assistant professor in film and media and communication in the Department of Media, Journalism, and Film at Miami. So welcome to you, Andy. And I realized that actually coincidentally, this is our second Page Views Live in a row where we are speaking with not only a scholar who is also a practitioner. So our last Page Views that we had this summer with Laura Mulvey about the recent publication of her writings with Peter Wolin was a great conversation about Laura's work, both on the page and on the screen. And for those of you who are interested, that conversation, as all our Page Views Live conversations, is archived on the Film Quarterly website. So you can find that there. And in a week or so, you'll be able to find this conversation there as well, as we record these for posterity and as a teaching and research resource. So it's great to have Andy here today to discuss his book, Political Camerawork, that is really a fascinating and very innovative approach to media phenomenology. So before we delve in, I will pass things over to you, Bruno, to give us a little introduction to the work that we'll be talking about today.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Andy, for being with us, and welcome to everybody for this version or this issue of Page Views Live. So as Rebecca introduced us to this, we'll be talking today about Andy Rice's new book, Political Camerawork, Documentary and the Lasting Impact of Reenacting Historical Trauma, which is a compelling and densely theorized book that unravels the significance and implications of documentary work in simulations and historical reenactments. So it's a particularly ripe concept for us to be talking about. And I'm interested also in how it becomes important for documentary scholars and documentary filmmakers to pay attention to this particular aspect of documentary making. So it kind of starts with the premise that in terms of camera work, the key paradigm of realist representation in documentary has been that of observational camera work. And for Andy, however, this representational scheme has deep ethical implications, especially when it sets out to represent simulations and historical reenactments. Part of the reason for this is that the non-interventional nature of observational camera work tends to conceal its conditions and context of production, and therefore leaves viewers to discover by themselves that the object of the gaze in such a case is a simulation or a reenactment. But Rice doesn't simply criticize observational camera work. He's also deeply invested in analyzing how it unfolds in the field, as well as its ethical ramifications in finished films. So drawing on his own work as a documentary filmmaker, Andy tasks himself with uncovering the cultural and technical legacy of realism in documentary work. Not only are camera persons trained in non-interventional camera work, but they also are immersed in a film culture that has privileged that aesthetic as a precondition for realistic representation. In simpler words, for better or for worse, observational camera is often, if not their starting point, the default approach for documentarians. So as he addresses in the book, Andy has had experiences with documenting reenactments and simulations to see firsthand how insufficient this kind of camera work can be for creating a critical approach, which he is asking us to privilege instead. As a way to convey the propensity of observational camera work to reproduce the ethics of what it represents, Andy resorts to 3 case studies throughout the book, and I'll briefly mention them here. The first one is a Vietnam War reenactment that takes place in Oregon, which was depicted in Mike Addy and Megan O'Haron's 2014 documentary In Country. The second one are 3-dimensional simulations that take place in Fort Orion Military Center in California, where American soldiers are sent for, in the words of the military, this is important, cultural awareness training. And Andy takes some issue with that term here. And the third and final one is an annual reenactment in Monroe, Georgia, of the Morris Ford lynchings of 1946, which Andy analyzes through the prism of phenomenology as a documentarian himself covering the reenactment, as well as through the prism of textual analysis, looking at Jacqueline Olive's 2019 documentary, Always in Season, in which his own footage is featured. So this is a really important book. I have it here, actually, I should show. This here is a really important book that serves both scholars and practitioners of documentaries. For scholars, it offers a unique perspective of embodied camera work that builds on ethnographic research, documentary practice, and film scholarship. And for documentary filmmakers, it's a plea for a conscious political use of camera work that draws on necessary ethical considerations. Ultimately, the book leads us to ask what it takes to escape the pitfalls of non-interventional camera work in simulation documentaries if one's goal and political inclinations do not align with those of the performances themselves. So I wanted to start our conversation first by thanking Andy for sharing his wonderful book with us and his time to be here today. But to go back a little bit to the origins of this project, which is about 20 years ago now, and maybe particularly about your film, About Face, and how that has oriented your research.
Yeah. First, I want to thank you guys for showcasing the book, for reading the book, Bruno for doing this amazing review. I really feel like in some ways I read it, I was like, well, now people don't need to read it. They can just read Bruno's review.
Let's hope that's not the case.
It's humbling and a little bit intimidating to be kind of like on the page with Laura Mulvey on the page views site. So all that said, thank you. And yeah, this is a project in many ways that I started when I was 22. And I started making this film called About Face, Reenacting in a Time of War in New England. It was after the 9/11 attacks, and I wanted to make a film that was about discourses about what war meant, how they traveled. And I came across a story about people who reenacted battles from the Revolutionary War. I ended up kind of going to one of these events, getting to know some of the people that were in it. And I thought, well, this could be an interesting kind of film to make. There's lots of things to see here. People are dressed up. They're doing things, very active. It seemed for all the world like a great space to do this kind of camera work. And my thinking about observational cinema is really from an insider's perspective in some ways. I've done a lot of this kind of work. I've thought about it a lot. I've watched a lot of the films that are kind of like form part of the canon. And I respect a lot of the work that comes out inside of this space. So what was interesting to me was to see how difficult it was to work this way inside of a reenactment space. Observational cinema has always kind of thrived in conditions where there's contingencies at work, where the things that surprise you are the things that can become the building blocks for the film. It's the kind of thing that Jean Rouch, in his writing in cinematography, called moments of truth. There's this thing that happens. I feel it when I'm behind the camera. I'm kind of invested in the people that I'm with as I film. In certain ways, I film with intention. I look at this, I look at that. But I'm also imagining forward to a time when someone else is going to see this. And if they connect with that moment the way that I do, then we've got something here. And the process, and I think this describes a lot of filmmaking, the process is about creating these little moments or finding them in the world and then condensing them so that they live one next to the other. And by the time you get enough of these and you can contextualize them enough, you have something approximating a film. So I thought that's what I was doing. It turns out it's tricky to film this way in contexts where the avenues for contingency are both winnowed in public performances. They're used in ways that you don't really have control over, which I was interested in that. Like, where do these discourses travel through the bodies of these reenactors after 9/11 and moving on into the war in Iraq? And second, because the stakes of the contingency are really internal in some ways. They're happening inside the people as they perform. Ironically, I realized once I'd kind of gone through this film and started participating, it was like a reverse participant ethnography of reenactment, that reenactors are seeking something very similar to camera people. You read books, you watch films, you study this particular period in history, you try to get all of the nitty-gritty details about the kind of fork that somebody had and the kind of buttons that somebody wore and the kind of shoes they might have had and what it felt like to sleep outside. And oh my gosh, if we walk in the rain, that'll be kind of like what these people went through, right? So there's endless ways that these are severe and profound limitations for reenacting something like a war, where the core element that's most important is about death and suffering. And at the same time, in building all these details together, the performance can have kind of heightened auratic stakes. You get these similar kinds of moments that reenactors call period rush. That's the word they use at times. Some reenactors don't like it very much, but it's the sense that, like, I understand that I'm here in the contemporary moment and in the present, but I also feel like I'm having this experience almost outside of my body, looking down at some vestige of something that existed in the past. And I see that and I feel it because of the constraints that I put on my body in the present to enter into a different way of thinking about the world, right? So again, you're looking for these moments that have heightened affective intensities there. And I found in making the film that there were a lot of ways, the other approaches to doing documentary work, things that were more conversational, things that were more reflective and voiceover driven, even reenacting in a slightly different context could be kind of interesting. So that was the where it kind of started me off in thinking about the kind of formal aspects of filmmaking there, but also the ethical questions. If you're enacting in a role with which you have qualms, what does it mean? How do you justify doing it? You're in some ways perpetuating a story with which you disagree. And I felt increasingly uncomfortable the more I learned about the history of some of these groups. The film at the end is kind of a reflection on a reactionary social movement from the 60s. It starts in the initial civil rights era reenactments, which coincided with the 100th anniversary of the Civil War. So a lot of big reenactments there. And then by the 1970s, some of those individuals and some people who were different, participating for different reasons, started reenacting the Revolutionary War. And it was infused with Hollywood special effects and makeup people that were helping produce these things. So there was this kind of interesting set of overlaps around the construction of a set of pageants that could do ideological work. And that felt like a big enough question to explore through the kind of stuff that you do in graduate school, book writing.
Right. And so one thing that a term that we employ in the book that becomes crucial for this kind of work that you're doing here is what you call simulation documentaries, which I kind of left out from my introduction because I wanted to get a chance to hear from you.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? And I feel like, I guess I'll pose the question as well. Do these Revolutionary War reenactments also apply, or does the term also apply to Revolutionary War reenactments, or are you referring to something else? Yeah.
Yeah, so I use the term broadly without, to describe something. I just struggled for language around this for a long time, and this is what I kind of came up with. So what I mean when I use the term simulation documentary is not just a film. I'm talking about a kind of ongoing, almost ritualistic performance site, a reenactment that happens every year. Another example in the book is the military training simulation that happens somewhat regularly, that offers a kind of spectacle in the present that is suffused with evidence that's not easily verifiable in some ways. It's very much felt, affective, and that is a lure for a camera. In part, that's because these sites often draw from people who work as professionals in the entertainment industry, as actors, technicians, makeup, wardrobe, a variety of people, and they're doing this as a kind of hobby or because they see it as a core activist kind of activity, as with the chapters in the latter half of the book, but also to draw in press, to draw in documentarians. So people that come and film these things become a part of an ongoing, maybe even more precise over time narrative that gets extended out into the world. So in that way, yes, the Revolutionary War reenactments and the people who participate in them are very much a simulation documentary in those terms, the way that I'm writing about it. So films are a part of it, right? You can have films that are kind of like participating in this ongoing process of performance, but that's not the core of it. It's kind of, I'm thinking about it in a more expanded term,
And I think that really reflects this idea of embodied camera work, right, or phenomenology of camera work, because it's in many ways you're describing and thinking about the position of the filmmaker in a simulation documentary, right? What choices are being made and seeking which results, right?
Yeah.
And how did you arrive at this particular framing, that is exploring simulation documentaries in these three sites that I briefly mentioned before? Did you go to them as part of a research project? Did the project come sort of after you have had those experiences? Were there more sites that you had considered or that you have experienced in some experience in, but didn't make it to the cut of the book?
Yeah, there were a few others. I mean, there are a number I was thinking about. And here I also have to credit Lisa Cartwright, who is my dissertation advisor. She is a feminist film theorist who's thought a lot about kind of realism through a critical lens, and led me to readings that were really helpful for thinking about both strategies in filmmaking that were going to be really different from the kinds of realist epistemologies associated with observational work, but also for kind of methodological approaches to the kind of things I was looking at. So Vivian Sobchak became a really important figure for me, largely through the kind of methodological orientation that she developed in her work from the early 90s. So she developed this approach called media phenomenology. She was drawing from this tradition in philosophy to study the kinds of things that were going through one's mind as they watch a film. Very idiosyncratic, very funny, kind of personal writing. And it struck me at some point, and I don't know exactly, I have to think about exactly when, that this wasn't a bad way to study the thing that I was doing if I kind of did the same thing in my own body as I was doing camera work, right? You do documentary camera work in a space that is structured for maybe a more conventional industrial cinematic kind of appeal, such as these Fort Irwin military training simulations. And then you can start to dig in a little bit on the patterns that emerge, the ways that feelings in this moment might touch other kinds of experiences that visitors have had. You can start to see things a little bit differently, more like culture than idiosyncratic personal events. So this was something I started. I actually heard about the Fort Irwin training simulations in 2007. There was an article in the New York Times about them. I was in graduate school at UC San Diego. It was 2.5 hours away. So I got in touch with the public relations officer there. Yeah, I was an early stage graduate. So nobody knew me from Adam. I was like, hi, I'd like to come watch what you guys do. And he said, sure. And I was shocked, like, why? So then I did, you drive out in the middle of the desert near a town called Barstow, California. It's in the middle of the Mojave. I got taken out in a Humvee to this area where they were essentially letting me film as close as I wanted to a simulated IED attack. For all the world, it looks like evidence of a war that's failing. And it's really interesting, the kinds of things that kind of happen in that space. The public relations officer who led me around there was very kind. He was gregarious. He had a lot of stories. He could kind of answer any questions I had. And at the same time, the things that were happening inside of the simulation space, which is meant to prepare troops that are going to deploy to Iraq. And this is 2007. So this is in the midst of a kind of like very difficult period for the US military, with improvised explosive devices being hidden in trash on street corners and this kind of thing. So they're training American soldiers to deal with those kinds of externalities and conditions, insurgent warfare. And it's shocking to be with that, where people are made up and there's smoke going around and there's loud explosions and gunshots and people screaming as though they're injured. It's shocking and familiar at the same time. It feels like a movie, and it's also very it's affecting. It hits you in your stomach in ways you can't quite articulate when it happens. And then immediately after that, this friendly public affairs officer could come in and explain why they were doing what they were doing, right? So there was something about this experience, and this was very early on, and I couldn't exactly put language to it, but I felt like I was a mark, just a little bit of mark, and it turns out that the experience I had was replicated, 50 times. There's the same individuals that show up in interviews across lots and lots of reports. So that was for me, that was maybe the starting point for thinking about turning these experiences with filming inside of reenactments and simulations into a kind of a disciplined book-length study. Right. Reading around and some writing on performance art was helpful as well. Peggy Phelan's Unmarked was a really important book. So on the back end, I was reading around a lot into kind of feminist film and performance theory, and using that as the lens to interpret something like public relations oriented framing of training during the Iraq War, almost as a way to mitigate the scandal of Abu Ghraib. That was where I started. That was kind of where I started.
Right. This is a really fascinating chapter in the book. To me, a lot of this information was brand new to me. I did find the New York Times article that you mentioned was sort of the origin of how you got to that. But I love how you sort of explore how the training center employs personnel and actors, extras, right, to simulate Iraqis in these situations, or Afghans in these situations, as well as special effects personnel, right? But the other thing that I think really implicates the filmmaker, and that seems to be the real seed in this work, in the scholarly work that turns out from this, which is the idea that the camera and the camera person are enveloped in this, in the discursive practice of the training, right? So you are helping train the soldiers in some ways, because the Iraq War was a media-inflected war, right? So you can say a little bit about that, about kind of realizing that you were part of the plot in some ways, right? Or you're part of the reenactment.
And if I can just add on to that question, because something I've been wondering about listening to this is when you were first talking about the military reenactment, the Revolutionary War reenactment, and that moment of sort of heightened affect. You described it where the reenactors know that they're sort of, and that there's this double consciousness that they're present, but they're also in the past. And how do you, in your role as the filmmaker, the cinematographer, how do you respond to that? And obviously, this is such a different context, what you're describing in California. And, you did just talk about the effective charge of that. So I'm wondering sort of how that differed. And then also for the reenactors, like, well, what did it mean for the soldiers who were involved in this simulation? And I'm just curious if you spoke with them about it.
Yeah, it's I spoke to a few of the soldiers who are involved. So there's a few different questions here. One is about, if I'm getting this right, Rebecca, the distinction between the Revolutionary War case and this one with Fort Irwin in Iraq.
Yeah, for you, in terms of how you're responding to this different effective charge of the reenactment.
Yeah. I will get to this one. I mean, it's funny when you're reenacting the Revolutionary War, there were no cameras in 1775. Right. So I couldn't film when I was participating as a reenactor. I had to work with other people. This was before there were GoPros. It wasn't like I kind of did like a MacGyver-esque thing and rigged a spy camera up for one, ridiculous scene. It was the Battle of Saratoga. There were like 2,000 people. There's a guy on a horse and, trying to film this stuff off of my hand. It really, it's kind of a wild scene. It ended up breaking. So I died in that one. I got, there's a guy on a horse that got me for that. And then I don't know. It was a strange day. But that was, so that's really different. And there's a case in the book that's looking at documentarians who are making a film about Vietnam War era reenactors, and they were told to play the roles of Vietnam era camera people, kind of in the way that Bruno's describing my role in the Fort Irwin reenactment. A little bit. You've got to be, part of being an effective soldier inside of this rhetoric, inside of this discourse, is being able to know how to behave well in front of a camera. Like Abu Ghraib demonstrated the costs of not behaving well. In many ways, the crime was not the sadistic things done to prisoners. The crime was photographing them. In that case, like in terms of the military. So part of the training, I think you're right. There was a way that having press there with cameras, they didn't see that as a downside for military preparedness. There are two ways to think about the soldier responses. And so, I did talk to a few of the soldiers when I was there on site, but it's not like a deep ethnographic dive, the way that you would, immerse yourself for years in a community and get to know people. It just wasn't realistic to approach it that way. It was more like a media ethnography in those senses. But, one guy said, yeah, it's good to learn how to kick down doors. There's a procedural realism in some ways. It's good to learn how to secure the perimeter around an IED attack if they're going to see these, and then to make sure that they can't get us going from this way or that way. So that was the way that a number of soldiers were thinking about it. The Public Affairs Office there said something really telling, striking, interesting as well. And that is that and this gets at the really tricky thing about realism in a space like that. For trainees who are 18 and have never been to war, the assaultive experience has to be hyper intense because they've played a lot of video games. They've played America's Army and Halo, and they watched war movies. And if they come into this space and it's not matching up to those experiences, that doesn't resonate. It doesn't do the kind of training, inculcation of fear that they're after, right? So in some ways, the affective experiences that they curate inside of these scenarios, they aim to be almost like a diorama style representation of violence. The diorama, we've got everything that ever happened in 2 million years in one little frame. So you can see all the different animals in an ecosystem all eating each other at the same time, right? It's like that, but 2 weeks of it inside of this training space for soldiers before they deploy, where the experience on the ground is going to be much more about, lots of boredom and things that are, a little more idiosyncratic. And that helps too for people that want to do stories about military training. They get to see something that's dramatic. There's almost like a little deal that's struck there. So you can go in for a day. You don't have to travel to Iraq. It's not as dangerous. You can, if you're in LA, you can just go a few hours to Barstow. You record some things. You talk to a few people. You have this story. It's got nice images. People, it's got, we'll click on it. It's got kind of a salience for contemporary life. But it isn't, these stories are not in some ways able to evaluate whether or not the training works. The people who could really, who we should be asking that question to. And this is something I started thinking, you know, long after I was there. It's not like, oh, see, you know, you think about it and it's like, what was going on in that place? But it really should be civilians on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan that are evaluating these things. I don't know how you do that study exactly, but ethically, that's the right answer, I think. It's certainly not these individuals who are either haven't been there, came 20 years ago. Some of the actors were Chaldean Christians that live in San Diego. They fled Iraq in the 80s or the 70s. And they play roles, and they can speak Arabic, so they could play roles in these simulations. And there are a couple people that showed up a lot in interviews with the press, you know, and those were the people that I talked to when I was there. So that, and it's also not the person who has been through really traumatic things to come back and say, this is real in some ways, because you don't need lots of assaultive sensations for that person to have return to the moment of trauma. It can be much more subtle in some ways. So oftentimes the visitors to these sites would look to the people that were around for evidence, and none of them are the right people to say whether or not the training works. There's something kind of interesting about that. I don't think it was, you know, intentional on anybody's part, but yeah, the question about why is maybe the more important one, and you can't get that very well in these reenactments.
It made me think, if I can go back to sort of camera work, the simulation documentary, the training center seems like a playground for filmmakers, right? Like, this is the kind of thing that you want to be involved in. And I think that one of the things you suggest is that a common result of that is an attempt to do crisis coverage, right? To sort of simulate or maybe reproduce with the camera work the intensity of that, the effective intensity of that moment, right? And so I think the implication here is that that kind of camera work ends up reproducing, you know, sort of the simulation of power and might of the American military, and not the critical work that you're doing now of thinking back, okay, this is not cultural awareness training. This is also a PR sort of plot, and there are other things that are at play here, right? Do you want to say anything about that before? I wanted to sort of use that as a bridge as well, but
yeah, the crisis coverage, you know, that's such a it's an interesting term. It's Marianne Doan wrote about this in relation to TV news, and I thought about it a lot with these films where, you know, in a reenacted scene where there's not really a reason for the camera to be panicked, it nonetheless touches back upon that precedent tradition, like the archived repertoire of crisis coverage, if you will, right? So that's, I don't want to go ahead if you have more that you want to ask about that.
No, I just wanted to think about how that's very different, I think, from your experience in the lynching reenactments, right? That you don't want to reproduce the violence. You don't want to make a spectacle out of the violence that is embedded in the reenactment, in a way that you might be more inclined, because the violence is in some ways what's exciting about the training center, right? It's what's really effective. And I think that the reenactment of the lynching is doing a more reflective kind of work, right? So do you want to talk a little bit about how different the experience was for you of being at these both sites with a camera, right? As someone who's attempting to document and to do work on these sites.
Yeah. So the third case study in the book, and this is one that I had some colleagues that pointed me to it, and they'd seen stories about it, is the Morsford lynching reenactment. It's the only one of its kind in the country, and has a very different ethical orientation. So I frame the three case studies in some ways through different ethical orientations. This one is much more about activism, advocacy for justice, and because of that framing, it has there's just a different set of concerns and considerations around putting this event on. There are a number, they've done it every year in Monroe, Georgia, and I say the organizers put this on, and they've shifted over time a bit, but they've done it every year in Monroe, Georgia since 2005. And the rationales for putting the reenactment on have changed across that time. The 1946 lynching was a quadruple lynching. There were two Black couples that were murdered by this bridge, George and May Murray Dorsey and Roger and Dorothy Malcolm. And it was a scandal in 1946 when it happened. The Truman administration launched a big, through the FBI, launched a 6-month-long investigation of what happened and tried to find the people who'd done it. But there was a wall of silence in the community that was born either from approval or fear of what would happen to them if they talked. And none of the perpetrators of the crime were prosecuted. So I think it's important to get the kind of sense of what was at stake here. When they started reenacting this event in 2005, because a lot of the goals at that point were to find information about the surviving members of this lynch mob to prosecute them. Right. So it wasn't about commemorating something. To some extent, it was about honoring the dead. And there were so there was a good deal of attention given to this story after the first reenactment. It was modeled after the Selma Bridge March, put on by Charles Steele. And then people started making films or news segments about it. It's really interesting to see the choices made in representing this event. So there was a series that Keith Beauchamp produced called Murder in Black and White. And one of the episodes, these are about cold case lynchings, and one of them was about the Moores Ford case. And it represents the event at the heart of the story in many ways obliquely. It's a reenactment. And when I talk about crisis coverage in documentary terms, this is the moment in the war event or civil unrest where the camera loses its mooring. It doesn't seem to be looking at anything anymore. There are sounds of shouts, but it's blurry footage, and the lack of control over the image suggests that politics are up for grab, that the kind of social order is under threat in some ways. There's some interesting writing about like the March in Selma and the television coverage of that event and how crucial it was to the kind of culminating events of the civil rights movement in the mid-60s. So you see this in the Keith Beauchamp's film. The lynching moment is represented through this kind of aesthetic. But there's a crucial moment inside of it, and it's a very short part of this hour-long film. It's about 4 minutes, where the camera looks back at the gun barrel of the lyncher, of one of the lynch mob. And that is maybe a key difference in his film from the kinds of things that I could record when I was on the site doing camera work. And this was in 2012. Jacqueline Olive and I had met because we were both interested in this site. And we were like, well, we can pool resources. I'm going to do some ethnographic research on it. She was going to do some filming for her project, which at that point was about restorative justice rituals around lynching. This ended up becoming Always in Season, which is a really different film. And the only footage that remained in that finished film was of the lynching reenactment. All the other stories had dropped away to focus on the tragic death of a young teenager in North Carolina named Lennon Lacey. So she handles the crisis coverage aspect quite differently. She was using news footage that she got the raw materials for, and whereas the news company that made this a little short about the lynching reenactment cut all of the in-between parts out. It looks very professional, very clean. Interview, clear shot, interview, clear shot. She left it in so that you get a bit of that kind of anxiety and uncertainty around the things that are happening largely through the movement of the camera through the space. And then she did some really interesting things with the editing later on, which is not about crisis coverage exactly, but it's a you know, is a clever way to handle the question you're asking about representing the violence.
Yeah. And it's interesting too that in the book you go into great detail about how she's the filmmaker is sort of avoiding these, this reproduction of the violence, right? And a lot of this has to do with what I might call extra cinematographic devices, right? Through editing, through maybe a voiceover, right? There are ways in which you can insert a critical lens onto the footage itself that you're employing. And I'm curious, how does this work? How are you trying to get to this work through an idea or the concept of political camera work? What might be the role of filmmakers who might be in situations of documenting simulations or reenactments whose ethics they don't necessarily comply with or agree with? How can they convey that through footage itself?
I'm just going to interject briefly and give you a moment to think about that, Andy, because I just noticed we have about 15 minutes left in the webinar. So I just want to encourage our audience, if you have any questions for Andy, to please go ahead and put that question into the Q&A and we'll be sure to get to you. So sorry to interrupt the flow. Please go ahead, Andy.
Okay. It's a great question. I mean, I think the short answer is to control the simulation itself, to know what it's doing for you. I mean, there are some really interesting examples, we might call performative documentaries that have come out in the last few years. I think a lot about Irene Lustig's Yours and Sisterhood, which is a reenactment film based on letters that were written to Ms. Magazine in the 1970s. And she returns to the place where they were, from which they were written, and has a contemporary woman read that letter to the camera and then reflect on what it feels like to put the words into her body. She calls it embodied listening. I wrote a piece about it. There's something kind of elegant and lovely about that way of thinking about reenactment here, where you're not beholden to the kinds of constraints that you might be if you just go into a space like Fort Irwin for one day and film and then leave and feel like you have a sense of it that you need. Around military work, Coco Fusco's filmmaking and performance art is pretty interesting in this regard. She made a really wild film called Operation Atropos, where she worked with a number of graduate students and hired a group that did military interrogations for this, I think it's the CIA. And they essentially put she and her graduate students through interrogations for 5 days in this compound to simulate what happened to political prisoners, right? The camera work, which is in many ways observational in its style, it's following these young women and Coco Fusco herself as they go through this, does little interviews with people, but they're controlling the kind of direction of it. It's following them, and they have a sense about what they're up to and what they want. And a lot of her work is operating in that way. I like that approach. I like thinking about the ways that performance can lead to documentary work that's about things you can't see.
Right.
And I think about Rithi Pond's work as well in this vein. S21, I mean, I remember seeing that and just being floored by that film. This incredible use of, and he doesn't like the word reenactment, but there is a way that the prison guards featured in this film who killed many, many people at the S21 prison, even when they were young themselves, 13 to 15. They can't talk about it. It's very flat, symptoms of like post-traumatic stress in some ways, but if they reenact the routines, there's this one guy that just like kicks to life, and you feel it and you see it, and it tingles your spine a little bit. It really does feel like a kind of evidence, and evidence for something that if you tried to observe that, it would be obscene.
Wow.
You can't make an observational film in a concentration camp. It's like, that's just not tenable way to proceed, right?
Yeah, I'm also thinking of the ways in which something like Walter Bashir, right, that has to do also with it's performative in many respects, and the animation itself is a kind of performance, right, to sort of reveal where's the trauma beneath these discourses and these speeches that are somewhat accepted and expected. It seems to me they're also getting to something that's key, which is not so much a prescription on what camera work should look like in these situations, but it's key for a filmmaker to be aware of their own impact, right, and their own the form with which they're participating in these reenactments, right? That theirs is also a work of performance, right? And that some things can be eliminated through that very understanding and that awareness.
I think that's right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are ways you can film to kind of subvert the intention of the thing you're filming, and people do that. It's certainly not the it's not the default in many cases. You know, we want to be ethical. We want to be friendly to the people that give us access to their lives. So there's you have to watch out for that, I guess. It's one way to think about it.
I can jump in for a moment, because I'm curious about how your work in reenactment, how that then sort of went into conversation with the film that you made with Zainabu Irene Davis on the LA Rebellion, which I haven't seen, but from what I read about it, it sounds like it's a more straightforward documentary project in terms of interviews and so on. So could you speak a moment about that film, which sounds fascinating, and then also sort of how your work on reenactment sort of played into it, or, you know, the conversation that you had there?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. Zainabu is another person I really need to thank, and whenever public forum I have a chance to do it. We were the two filmmakers in a communication department, and we bonded over that. I'd seen Charles Burnett's film Killer of Sheep when I was an undergrad, because I had Bruce Jenkins was my professor at the time, and he had a bootleg VHS copy of that film when nobody could see it, and showed it in an independent film class. And it just made me think that's what I want to do. I want to make films like that. I want to, understand how that works and how it's made. And so the first time I met Zainabu, she said, "Oh yeah, Charlie shot my student film." I was like, "What?" So I was in, right? And for that film, I was a co-producer on it and an editor, and did a lot of behind the scenes work. We wanted it to be accessible to a general audience. I think there's a space for that kind of film. The films of those makers themselves are really interesting, and we wanted to foreground those in a way that could be used in teaching. And so it is a fairly straight historical documentary. It relies on the words of people talking about their intentions and their art, and what happened to them, and we wanted the film to offer an alternative account of what independent film meant after 1970. It's not just about, the kind of movie brats moving into the industry. This is a really different ethic. And it's not necessarily just by structural constraints, a story about people who went through film school and then made lots of films. One thing that Haile Garima says in the film is like, white kids graduated into an industry. We graduated into a desert. And that's a really cruel thing. He's right. And at the same time, there are people that became really interesting teachers in Los Angeles. Alile Sharon Larkin turned her, really interesting work as a filmmaker at UCLA into pedagogy in a classroom, made lots and lots of films with students about, multicultural histories inside of LA classrooms. Bernard Nicholas tried to start a distribution company for African films in the US. There's all these really interesting stories that come out of it. Ben Caldwell runs the Chaos Network in LA, which is like a youth cultural center. And he'd like to get back to making films, but feels like this is the thing that his filmmaking has led him to need to do. There's something really rich about that, and kind of lovely. So as somebody working on that project, I learned a lot just being behind the camera, trying to follow what people were saying, piece together stories that made sense. As an editor, listen very carefully when Zainabu said no, and think about what it meant to be a fellow traveler for culture that's not one's own. That helped a lot in the case in Georgia as well. I mean, I think that there's some overlaps there.
Right.
And Andy,
Well,
what?
5 minutes. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Rebecca.
I was just going to do the 5-minute reminder in case
Okay, I'll
anyone
stop.
has a question.
Oh, there's
Now I was going to take this opportunity to ask if what you're working on, what's your new project?
So I'm starting to think about a book on reparative documentary, and it comes quite very strongly out of this work. I kind of kicked around like, well, maybe I'm looking at something like the virtual camera, look at like how wearable cameras are kind of used and embedded in areas of nonfiction that's not about ocular centric vision. I wrote an article on that with Lisa. But the reparative strain's kind of interesting, especially after COVID. I thought about this a lot, that the constraints put on filmmakers by dint of not being able to move around led to more inward facing kind of work. You can see this a lot in films that came out in 2022, 2023. There's a lot of kind of deep reflection amongst filmmakers who have done things that aren't exactly that way previously. Somebody like Andy Timoner's Last Flight Home is one that sticks out. So I wanted to write about that, like how those constraints kind of lead to this reparative dynamic, and to think more broadly about what reparations are in documentary filmmaking. And that can go back with, filmmakers that are working in historically oppressed communities back to the 70s or 80s. Not a new thing there, but it's writ large in some ways with the pandemic. So I'll stop there, and we're short on time.
Fantastic. Looking forward to seeing that.
Our audience is being quiet today. So
no, I think I kind of asked this briefly earlier, but I didn't mention anything in particular. Were there other sort of simulation documentaries that you had considered for the book, or that you actually did visit, right, or work in, whether maybe since the publication or even during your project that we didn't see in the final version of the book?
Yeah, there was one my performance artist named Dred Scott called Slave Rebellion Reenactment. It was a reenactment of the largest slave revolt in U.S. history that came out. They completed this in 2019. That one seemed really interesting. Would have been John Okomfra was associated with that project as a filmmaker, and I'm not sure. I've looked around. I haven't found a work that's come out of that, so I don't know what the status is on that project. That one was really compelling in some ways. There was a museum in Indiana that reenacted for a while an Underground Railroad experience. And they closed that down because there were some people that were deeply affected by it and started like attacking actors in the performance. I thought about that one a little bit. And then there were things like Marina Abramovich's reperformance works that were in MoMA, generated a lot of interest and controversy. Some of Amelia Jones' writing around that was compelling. So some of those I like, well, okay, I can't do that here. I'm going to go there'll be another project. We'll bracket that and kind of put it later. So I do still think about the long duration performance works kind of in this space too. But yeah, those were, I wrote lots of other stuff too. I didn't make it in, but
yeah. Great. No, those look very interesting. Wonderful. We have a question here, right?
Yeah, we do have a question. Yay. So this is from April Lindala, who's asking, did you find or explore any Indigenous nations, Indigenous peoples reenactments? I was thinking of the performance of the Mushhole and 1923's performance about boarding school experience.
I'm actually not familiar with that one. That sounds fascinating, though. In 1923 boarding school experience, there's a reenactment of that.
Yeah, I don't know, April, if you want to add any clarifications to the chat, please go ahead. And just what it writes here is the Mush Hole and 1923's performance about boarding school experience.
No, I didn't, and I'm not familiar with that one. And I certainly television, not theater. Okay.
Oh, on the Yellowstone series. Well, new material to look into.
New material. Yeah. April, if you'd like to talk offline, I'd be curious to hear more.
Great. Well, good. Well, that's, the sort of conversation we want to get started with these webinars. So, I think we can wrap up there. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Before we go, I'd like to mention a few announcements. First is that we will be having our next Page Views Live conversation sometime in the winter. Bruno will be speaking with Ji Lee. I'm not sure about pronunciation, about her new book, Cinematic Gorillas, which is a really fascinating study about exhibition and distribution networks in socialist China, 1950s and 1960s socialist China. Really, really interesting book. So be on the lookout for our announcements for that. And for those of you who want to rush out and get a copy of Andy's fantastic book, we actually do have a discount code from Indiana University Press that we can, I think, share in the chat right now. I'll just put that in, that save 30. Is that right, Andy?
That's it. Yeah.
All right. So you can save 30% on Andy's book and any other Indiana title today. And yeah, look out for this webinar. Will be up on our website, filmquarterly.org, in about a week's time. So thank you all so much for coming. Many thanks to you, Bruno, and to you, Andy, for doing this work, for writing this book, and for speaking about it in such a fascinating manner. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.